Hello, everybody. I was Bob's brother. As many of you can imagine, the last year or so, and most recently, in the past few months, have been challenging for my family. It's days like today that bring a little laughter and smiles back into our lives. Speaking for my parents and myself, I would like to sincerely thank all of you for coming today to honor Bob. After all, it's Memorial Weekend. There are many things you could have done and places you could have gone, but you came here, and we are extremely touched and grateful. On behalf of my family, I would also like to thank everyone involved with putting on this wonderful tribute to Bob. In the interest of time, I can't name everyone because Herb Duncan over here is probably watching my time. But I would like to thank Roger Cash, whose confidence and steady hand guided the planning committee, who, by the way, worked without a contract. And to the bandstanders, whose execution is unmatched and was, in Bob's opinion, when he mentioned at the dinner in California how Rose Bowl week went off without a glitch. They say Mussolini made the trains run on time, but the bandstanders made sure the buses and the events ran on time during Rose Bowl week and now. To the Concord Baptist Church, our sincere thanks for letting us hold this event in your beautiful facility and the assistance and the help of your staff. Last but certainly not least, I would like you to join me in thanking two very special people who, without them, this event, and more importantly, many leading up to today, would not have been possible. I'm speaking of Bob's and my parents, Fred and Cecile, who next month will be celebrating their 60th wedding anniversary. Mom, Dad, every year around the holidays, they have a classic American movie named It's a Wonderful Life. Director Frank Capra weaves a touching story about a life of a man named George Bailey, who was an ordinary man who wound up having an extraordinary life. He grew up and lived in an average town of Bedford Falls, where he had big hopes and dreams, but wound up usually putting the needs of others before himself. So was the life of my brother Bobby, as we called him. He and I grew up much the same way. We were raised in a very middle-class setting in University City, living in a modest two-bedroom home. I like to say that my parents gave us most of what we needed, but not everything we wanted. We didn't wear designer clothes or go out to eat often, and no, they didn't buy us a car on our 16th birthday, or any other one for that matter. I can remember my mother saying, "You want a car? Get a job." And we did. They taught us good, solid values about respect and integrity, things like the golden rule: treat people like you want to be treated. George Bailey had dreams too, to travel the world and see other places, but things always seemed to come along and prevent it from happening. He felt the obligation to take over his father's building and loan when he died, since he felt someone had to protect the people of the town from that old nasty banker, Mr. Potter. Well, some things haven't changed. And George Bailey considered, what would poor Uncle Billy do if he walked away? He married his high school sweetheart, Mary, and they planned to take that trip for their honeymoon with the money George had been saving all those years. But as luck would have it, when they were leaving town, George noticed that people were running through the streets in the snow and the cold, and he asked Ernie, the cab driver, "What's going on?" "There's a run on the bank," he told him, "but don't worry about it." People were in a panic. George knew he just couldn't leave town with that going on. He jumped out of the cab and ran to the building and loan and calmed the people down and paid them out of his honeymoon money. You may wonder, why am I telling you about this old Christmas story? Well, from the way I've always seen it, and I'm sure Mr. Capra did too, this was much more than a Christmas story. It was about life and how one person can truly make a difference in the lives of so many. Dozens of people we've met in the past several months have come forward with their stories about how Bobby inspired and touched their lives in a profound way. Kind and moving comments on the Carebridge site. See, George Bailey was like that too, but when things got rough for him, he felt he was alone and running out of options. He even considered taking his own life, especially after Mr. Potter told him that his insurance policy had no value to borrow against, when he said to him, "You're worth more dead than alive, George." But then he found himself by the bridge at the river and contemplating what to do. His guardian angel Clarence appeared and jumped into the icy river below. And then George jumped in to save him without thinking about it. Bob had that same unselfish quality. He jumped in to save the family of a high school band involved in a tragic bus accident in Wisconsin. The band director, his wife, and their daughter were killed, and Bobby acted without hesitation with the help of some others and raised $3,000, and he personally drove to Wisconsin to present the money to the survivors of the family and started what is now known as the PBM Lambda Foundation to help future victims. Both my brother and I were influenced by people like Martin Luther King, President Kennedy, and his brother, who also was named Bobby. I know my brother was deeply impressed with his quotations and kept one on his desk which read, "Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream of things that never were and say why not." It was kindly given to me by Dan Arana, his assistant, when I recently spoke to Bob's band. It's now on my desk. After George saved Clarence, they were drying out in the toll booth. He muttered, "You know, I wished I'd never been born." At first, Clarence said, "Oh, you mustn't say that, George." Then Clarence got an idea. After all, he was trying to earn his angel's wings. And he looked up to heaven to consult Joseph, his boss in heaven. And he said, "That might just work. What do you think, Joseph?" "All right, I'll try that." He said, "Okay, George, you've got your wish. You've never been born." And George just dismisses Clarence as some crazy old man and disgusted now. He says, I need to get home." They start heading back to what was Bedford Falls, and they see a sign that's now Pottersville. And it was full of debauchery and drunkenness. And it was no longer the wholesome town he helped to build. They went into a bar and discovered his old boss, Mr. Gower, was now a drunk who was his pharmacist. And he says, "Clarence, you weren't there to save him from making that fatal prescription when he was distraught over the loss of his wife." They stopped by the graveyard, and he saw the grave of his brother, Harry, who had died when he was 9 years old. George protested that he had saved his brother from drowning in the pond when they were kids. Clarence said to George, "You weren't here to save Harry, so he drowned, and so did all the men on his ship in the war, and they all died." Then he told him, "You see, George, you really did have a wonderful life." The parallels to the character of George Bailey and Bob Spiegelman are very much the same. Ask yourself this question: what if he had never been born? Like George Bailey, he touched so many throughout his life and inspired countless students with his passion. He truly did have a wonderful life. Even though it was tragically cut short, he saw and did things many of us will never do. As Dr. Sanford pointed out, he loved to travel, and he did travel many places. And he took his bands, as he said, with him to places like, he said, Paris, France, England, Hawaii, and the Rose Bowl, twice. He met many interesting and distinguished people, and at least 2 presidents. He also had a great sense of humor, and of course his trademark smile. I was told a story by one of his friends when he was about to meet General Alexander Haig, who served under President Nixon, and once claimed he was in charge. After Nixon resigned, Bobby told his friends that he was going to ask the general if he was still in charge. But he thought it better that he didn't. To quote a great American author, Ralph Waldo Emerson, "It's not the length of one's life that matters, but rather the depth." As George Bailey and Clarence proceeded through town, George became increasingly aware of the life he had apparently lost. His own mother didn't know him, and then he demanded to know where his wife was. And Clarence said she was at the library and that she was an old maid. And George ran to the library to catch up to her after she was leaving work, but she didn't know who he was and thought he was a crazy man. And George had to run and leave town because they were after him. And then all he could do was beg Clarence for his life back because he realized what he'd had. Well, he got his wish. And as he ran through Bedford Falls, all was right again, and he was so happy. He burst through his house and ran up the stairs and hugged his kids because he knew his family was what matters most. The same was true with my brother. My parents and I know how much he loved us. We've been told by many how happy he was that we were all there with him in California this past January for the Rose Bowl. And although he didn't have kids of his own, his band parents, students, were his kids. On the morning of the Rose Bowl parade, after they finished breakfast and were preparing to leave for Pasadena, he spoke to them and he said, "When you're standing out there on Colorado Boulevard, I want you to take a look around and see where you are, and I want you to take it all in and have the time of your life." Even though his health was not very good at the time, he was concerned about their happiness. After George Bailey hugged his kids and his wife, he went downstairs with them and saw his living room was filled with all the people that had helped him through the years. They were all there now, coming to help him. He realized at that point in time he was not alone, nor was he poor. In fact, he was very wealthy indeed. Bobby Kennedy once said, "People will forget the things you say, they will forget the things you do, but they will never forget the way you made them feel." As I look around this room today, and I see so many that came to pay tribute to my brother, it's obvious he too had something money can't buy. He had people who cared about him. So here's to my brother Bobby, who was the richest man in town.